everyone. Welcome to the debrief. It's day 3 of testimony in the Arizona trial of a man accused of shooting a live PD officer in the face. Ramon Bueno is the defendant. Trooper James Casey, the victim who survived. Casey is slated to testify. Testimony late yesterday involved accusations by a gang unit detective that defendant Ramon Bueno's tattoos show he's a member of an Arizona Mexican mafia street gang. The detective testified off camera.
You see the brown pride, and it's in a top elevated position on the chest. That would be considered political ink. The Kofelt, that's the street gang affiliation, the Kofelt Jets.
Has Mr. Bueno in the past, prior to this date, been documented as a member of the Kofelt Jets?
Yes. You see Mr. Bueno's street name, nickname, Mono, on his right inner arm. You see on his left bicep area, you see the steps to the pyramid, and you see feathered serpent, which is very significant to the Arizona Mexican Mafia. Quetzalcoatl is a figure that was one of the gods or the deities worshipped by the Aztec culture. There's a lot of pride for the Hispanic tradition within the Mafia. So they use and sometimes abuse the race card. Once you get inside prison, it becomes like the Aryan Brotherhood and the Peckerwoods and the skinheads for the whites, the Arizona Mexican Mafia, maybe Grandel.
The defense moved for a mistrial by arguing that the gang expert's analysis of the defendant's tattoos could lead the jury to believe the defendant had already been to prison once before on a separate charge.
Expert, who's highly exalted, when his tattoos of his torso and these gang tats are on the screen, talks about DOC and the power they elicit in DOC. We don't object to the tattoos being shown; they have to show them. But those coupled with that testimony, it was so easy to have avoided references to DOC, but we didn't. It's not Ms. Dahl's fault, but it happened.
The state said the defense was taking a logical leap there, that the jury was not likely to make itself.
It is, in fact, a criminal street gang, which, while it may not help the defendant, it is an element that we have to prove that he was part of the Arizona Mexican Mafia. The state has alleged it. That is what the prison gang is. It's not pretty. We're pointing out the fact that we believe that he shot a police officer in the face. All of this evidence hurts the defendant, but it is not unfair. And in fact, the state, and quite frankly, the witness, has gone to great lengths to point out that these are generalized things that he looks at in his expertise and why they are important. And again, no one has made reference to the fact that Mr. Bueno may have been in custody prior to the date of this offense. I think the motion for mistrial should absolutely be denied.
The judge denied the motion but said any references to the defendant's prior record would be grounds for a mistrial. A man who was staying at the Knights Inn where the shooting happened described hearing his dog growling at 1:30 in the morning and seeing a cop car which had pulled over a vehicle.
So as I was entering my room, I heard a gunshot go off, and I turned around and actually ran with my dog all the way down to the balcony and to see what was going on. They had a dark burgundy Toyota Camry, Honda, whatever you want to call it, but it was a small 4-door vehicle, and they had just pulled it over, and they were actually going back and forth with gunshots. I know there was gunshots coming from the vehicle that they had pulled over, and then there were 3 officers behind that vehicle who were shooting back. In the middle of all that going down, one of the officers actually got hit in the face or got shot and went down to the ground. He looked like he was alive still. So the other 2 officers were actually trying to get him out of the line of fire, but the guys in the burgundy vehicle were actually just kept on shooting. Eventually they ended up peeling out, and the other 2 officers managed to get the downed officer out of the way. And then from that point on, I just kind of went back to my room.
That same witness then described where the shots came from and what the people inside the car looked like.
The rear back windshield. So there was nothing coming out of the passenger windows. It was all going straight out the back.
And did you indicate that you believe that the right front passenger seat was a female wearing pink?
Both the front passengers were female, yes.
Do you remember if they were white, Hispanic, African American?
I just know what kind of clothes they were wearing and what gender they were.
Do you remember looking into the vehicle and seeing any occupants that may have been in the back seat of that vehicle?
Yes, there was what looked like a person sitting in the back seat behind the driver wearing white. But I know at the time there was another individual that I could kind of make out the silhouette on the passenger side rear. But I didn't know what they were wearing.
I'm sorry.
So I didn't know what they were wearing, and I didn't know what gender they were.
The state says Bueno fired from the passenger seat of that car. The woman driving the car took the stand today. Her name, Lori Richardson, and she agreed to plead guilty to a lesser charge of hindering prosecution with a sentence of only probation. The judge ordered us not to show her face or broadcast her voice for her safety. Rachel Stockman here at Law&Crime breaks down the testimony.
Lori Richardson says on the night in question, she agreed to give a few people she didn't know a ride in exchange for gas money. The passengers put a crate in her trunk and told her where to drive. When Trooper James Casey pulled them over, Richardson said her male passenger said, "I'm not going back in." 2 more officers arrived. Richardson says she heard a loud noise, and then the male passenger told Richardson to start the effing car. She says she only saw a silhouette of a gun. Bullets were flying as Richardson drove away. 2 of the passengers jumped out of her car. She ultimately abandoned her car at a vacant house. A few days later, a friend convinced her to call police. Richardson admits she didn't tell investigators the truth at first. She did name defendant Ramon Bueno to authorities, but did not directly ID him as the shooter. She did say the shooter was sitting directly behind her. When asked if Trooper Casey did anything to prompt being shot, Richardson said, "No, he was actually really nice." I'm Rachel Stockman for Law&Crime.
Let's go to the panel now. Attorney Tiffany Simmons is in Atlanta tonight, along with Mike Korabanix and Brian Buckmeyer here in New York. So, Brian, the defense says this is a case about a lack of identification. The key witness, whose testimony we just heard, ID'd Bueno as the man sitting behind her. The trooper said the shots came from the rear driver's side window, but the eyewitness we heard from at the hotel said the shots came out the back windshield. Is this just adding up to be more problems for the state?
It is, and from what I've seen so far with this defense, they're very smart, very calculated, and if you start adding these up, you kind of present them to the jury and you say, hey, what is the story? That may be enough for reasonable doubt.
Tiffany, in Atlanta, your assessment here, the police are saying, well, the windows were tinted, it was hard to see. The witness in the hotel didn't seem to have an issue seeing gender and clothing.
Right. But I agree with Brian. It just adds more speculation. It just adds to reasonable doubt. It just adds to problems for the state to show that Bueno was the shooter.
Mike Korabanix here in New York. You're a former prosecutor, currently in criminal defense work. You had some big issues with that motion for the mistrial. You don't like the tangled web of gang affiliations coming into this trial.
Not at all. I think it's going to present problems. If there's a conviction, it's going to create major problems for the prosecution because this is so prejudicial because they haven't come forth and shown anything that shows that this was acted in furtherance of a gang activity. That's the crucial point they haven't met the burden of.
Brian Buckmeyer, do you agree with Mike's assessment there?
I agree. I think the only thing you can really glean from this whole gang activity is to say, hey, he's in a gang, he's a bad person, bad people shoot and kill people. Other than that, I don't see the relevance here, and that is so prejudicial with very little to no probative value.
Yeah, Tiffany, that sounds like character evidence to me, and we're not supposed to convict people based on character evidence.
Exactly. It does sound like it goes towards his character. Maybe because he's in a gang, he's dangerous or violent. However, it does not prove that he was the shooter of the gun that shot the officer in his face.
You know, he's in the car. I think we've gotten there with some of the testimony from the driver. The question is who pulled the trigger, and we have a lot of disputes as to exactly who did that. So this trial moves along starting next week. Meantime, a multi-million-dollar lawsuit to discuss tonight from the man acquitted of shooting Florida teenager Trayvon Martin. George Zimmerman is going after 11 defendants, including Trayvon Martin's mother and father, their attorney Ben Crump, and the publisher of Crump's book. Zimmerman was acquitted, of course, of murder and other charges after shooting the unarmed Martin during a scuffle. Now, Zimmerman claims the laundry list of defendants conspired against him to defame him and maliciously prosecute him. Trayvon Martin's family says there's no evidence of that. According to the lawsuit, Zimmerman lives in constant fear of physical harm, regular death threats, often expressed in rap music. A man attempted to murder Zimmerman, missing his head by inches. Zimmerman was kicked out of college, has suffered nearly a complete loss of income as he cannot find work because of his single quote, infamy. Those are the letter of the language in the civil case. Attorney Tiffany Simmons joined tonight by attorney John Phillips from Florida. So John, you blogged a lot about this lawsuit last night and you called it an unprofessional, inappropriately litigious, and sloppy document. Break that down for us.
So, first of all, it's all of the facts therein were known in 2013. So we've blown the statute of limitations. We've inserted scandalous, redundant, accusatory language, which you can't do. Where we're hearkening our $100 million lawsuit in front of the media, which you can't do. We're doing everything. This lawyer, Larry Klayman, is doing everything wrong. DC's already fussed at him and tried to punch his bar ticket. Florida's going to take a strong look at him, I imagine, after this. It's not how lawyers are supposed to act.
Okay, Tiffany, this lawsuit basically alleges a vast conspiracy against George Zimmerman, and it tries to relitigate the factual issue of whether Zimmerman was the initial aggressor here. How do we make sense of it at this point, this many years after that shooting?
You can't make sense of this. It's disgusting. It's immoral. I felt sick to my stomach to see that he had the audacity to file this lawsuit against the family, against the attorney, against the book writer over his actions. He fails to remember his actions caused this. His actions caused the death of Trayvon Martin. Trayvon, he is not here today because of his actions. And so he should blame himself, not anyone else.
John, you predict that the defendants will successfully move to strike much of the language in the complaint and might even face trouble themselves because not all of this complaint document is privileged in your viewpoint.
Right. So once if a lawyer files a document, it's got absolute privilege. There's no question that the complaint is privileged and the lawyer and the defendant can't be brought up on defamation charges, for instance, civil or criminal, because there is a criminal defamation statute in Florida. But once you start leaking it around and giving it to others and talking about it, you do risk exposure. The immunity goes away and you have your own problem. And what he's done is brought a suit against, John Guy, who was the prosecutor, who's an active judge right here in Jacksonville, Angela Corey, everybody involved except for his own attorneys, by the way, who knew the allegations they say he didn't know. But I suspect the first thing that's going to be filed is a motion for sanction. In federal rule, it's Rule 11. In Florida, it's statutory 57105. They're going to move for sanctions, move to have it dismissed because it's just so scandalous and so over the top. Polk County is a pretty conservative, small county. I suspect those judges will understand what this actually was and not stand for it.
John, you've got a great analysis up on your website, so I encourage people to read that. Let's turn now in-house quickly. Brian, you were talking about this on Twitter. You don't like the precedent that it sets where a man acquitted of criminal charges and turns around and sues the victim's family.
Yeah, it's going to open the floodgates to so many problems. And so I agree with my other guests here. I mean, I'm disgusted by it. There's a part of me that wishes he just crawls into a rock and we don't have to talk about him ever again. But I think he's going to get shut down for all the reasons we've already listed. But also the precedence that this could open up is something that I think is going to scare a lot of people and say, hey, we don't want this to be an avenue for people who get acquitted.
Mike Korobenek's final thoughts on this one.
It's upsetting. I think it's very upsetting. I think it sets a bad precedent. And I think that this Zimmerman should just go off into the sunset and count his blessings he wasn't convicted.
And still ahead tonight here on The Debrief, we're going to talk about a deadly shooting at a U.S. Navy base in Hawaii, plus the late verdict after 3 hours of deliberation in the murder trial of Mark Sievers over the death of his wife, a physician. Those cases are when we come back. An American Navy sailor has killed 2 civilian employees and injured another before taking his own life. This shooter was on active duty with the submarine USS Columbia. The sub was in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii for maintenance work. The attack is just days before the anniversary of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, which 78 years ago drew the United States into World War II. And now to the late verdict last night in the trial of a Florida man accused of killing his wife and his business partner. Mark Sievers now stands convicted of being the ringleader behind the murder of Dr. Teresa Sievers. A colleague found the doctor beaten to death with a hammer in her own home. Husband Mark Sievers said he didn't do it, that his friend Curtis Wright and Wright's friend Jimmy Rogers were the real men to blame. The jury did not buy that argument, likely due to the messages back and forth between Wright and Sievers. Here's the reading of the verdict against Mark Sievers.
Verdict. We, the jury, find as follows as to the defendant in this case. Count 1, first-degree murder. The defendant is guilty of first-degree murder. Conspiracy. The defendant is guilty of conspiracy. So say we all, December 4th, 2019, by the foreperson.
The defense said Mark Sievers did not conspire to kill his wife and placed the blame, as we said, squarely on Curtis Wright, who did computer work for the wife's clinic and whose story the defense tried to pick apart.
Why? Why is Teresa Sievers dead? The best answer we can give you is she is dead because Curtis Wayne Wright killed her. The only evidence you have of someone promising payment came from Curtis Wayne Wright. And then when we asked Mr. Wright, his answer was, I don't remember. Mr. Wright is not allowed to forget. Failure of memory is an insufficient reason to allow Mr. Wright to retain his advantageous plea deal. Without Mr. Wright, there is no case. You each have to believe Mr. Wright's story about this conspiracy. You must each believe it, hook, line, and sinker, beyond and to the exclusion of every reasonable doubt, because he is the only witness who gave any evidence of a conspiracy. Curtis committed a murder with a hammer in a house that was full of knives and guns. And so it's interesting that while Curtis says he got the garage code, the door code from Mr. Sievers, he could have just as easily gotten the code to the safe and used a gun.
That was the losing argument. The state said husband Mark Sievers was the one who put the whole plan into motion and that the conversations between the husband and Curtis Wright proved it.
But for Mark Sievers, Teresa Sievers would not have been found dead on her kitchen floor in a pool of blood. But for Mark Sievers, a brutal homicide would not have occurred. But for Mark Sievers. Mark Sievers is the catalyst. Mark Sievers is the cause. Mark Sievers is responsible for Teresa Sievers' brutal murder, and he should be held so accountable. How much is a human life worth? Most never even.
Objection, Your Honor, improper.
Sustained.
Let's jump back in with our experts now. Tiffany Simmons, here's the way I boil this down. You can try to sit and trash Curtis Wright all you want if you're the defense, but what about the text messages with the defendant's own words talking nonstop to Curtis Wright leading up to the actual killing?
Exactly. One thing I quoted earlier, he cannot get around the text messages and the phone conversations and the code words, etc. So unfortunately for Mr. Sievers, he was found guilty. I wasn't surprised at the verdict.
I wasn't either. I think the defense tried to tell a solid recap story here, Brian Buckmeyer, on the tail end here, but the weight of the evidence is ultimately how the trial was decided.
All right, so basically this is how trials work or summations work. You do one of two things as a defense attorney. You either provide an alternative story that is more reasonable than that of the prosecution, or you show gaping holes where the jury has to make logical leaps to find that person guilty. And so you show them that, hey, there's too many holes here. They didn't do either of them. And the story by the prosecution was solid, and they did nothing to chip away at it.
Mike Korobanex, you're the former prosecutor here. Here's my question for you. Could a different defense attorney have won this case, or were the facts just that overwhelming?
I think the facts were very overwhelming in this case, but I just never got a rhythm of the defense, and I think there was a lot to work with here. I mean, the thing was you would say to the jury, why would you, if you wanted to separate yourself from a murder, hire people you know? And I think that was something they should have played on a little more.
Tiffany Simmons, I'll ask you the same question here. I wasn't really thrilled with some of the defense tactics in this case. It felt like the defense was just talking for the purpose of talking. Compare that with what we're seeing in the trial we started off with in the shooting of the live PD officer, where the defense is going in like a laser beam and just finding those wedge issues, pounding them quickly, and then moving on.
Right. I think in the Sievers trial, the defense, they kind of lost their steam. They didn't have a lot to hang on. And again, like Mike said, you have to have other alternatives. You have to, give something that makes sense. And they simply didn't do that.
Brian Buckmeyer, yeah, the lack of a theme here ultimately fatal. The defendant crying there as he was led away. He broke down eventually there, but when that verdict was read, he was pretty stoic.
Yeah. Everyone responds to that differently. I mean, I've been there before. I've seen my clients during verdicts. I see them take acquittals and they're crying. I see them take acquittals and they're stoic. People react differently based on the verdicts, and sometimes emotion is too much for them at that moment.
Sometimes it takes a couple of seconds to sit in. Thanks a lot to the panelists tonight. Great opinions here on the debrief. We are out of time. Brian Ross Investigates is next here on the Law and Crime Network. We here on the debrief. We'll see you back here live tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern.